Octopath Traveler 2 is the best kind of sequel. It takes the foundation from the original Octopath Traveler and adds to it in a variety of ways, as well as mixing up the formula subtly, enough that you get more Octopath, but also slightly better Octopath. It's not going to shake things up enough that if you hated Octopath Traveler 1, you'll suddenly love Octopath 2, but at the same time, it doesn't make substantial changes enough that if you loved Octopath 1, you'll dislike Octopath 2. However, if you were in the middle group, where you enjoyed Octopath for a little bit, but felt that the combat system lacked in complexity and the story got a little bit repetitive, I think that Octopath 2 made enough changes, and purely additive ones in my opinion, that you will likely enjoy it enough to make this a worthwhile addition to your games library. That's my opinion on Octopath, and I went ahead and put that up front so that if you wanted sort of a spoiler-free recommendation for or against, I would say for, especially if you enjoyed the first Octopath, but if you hated it, it's not going to change your mind, and so against if you hated it. Go ahead and click a like on your way out the door, and I'm going to delve deeper into a lot of the mechanical and story changes that Octopath 2 makes that I think are why it is in just about every way superior to its prequel, as well as the ways in which it kind of falls short. Because there are definitely some areas that stick out as having rather archaic design choices behind them, and it leads to a bit more frustration because it stands out against the overall high quality of the rest of the game. In fact, in many ways, I would compare Octopath 2 to Engage. It's extremely high quality in the majority of areas, which makes the areas where it struggles really stand out, and the frustration is sort of multiplied by the fact that a lot of the areas where it struggles could have been very easily fixed with a couple of minor changes, especially around the UX. But let's not start out with the negative. Let's instead dive into a refresher of some of the systems from Octopath 1, because they are mostly lifted wholesale into Octopath 2. You have 8 characters, and each of them has field skill that they can use to do something in town, such as steal an item, or convince someone to follow you around and then help out in combat. They also have a list of class skills that anyone in the class can access, and an individual skill just to them. So for example, anyone who gains Apothecary as their secondary class is able to use the various Apothecary spells, but only the base Apothecary, Alphen in Octopath 1 and Casti in Octopath 2, can mix concoctions from materials. You can get secondary classes by visiting shrines in Octopath 1 and equipping them to different players. Classes will give you access to spells and weapons, and it's important to have a variety of elemental spells and weapons because the combat in Octopath Traveler really revolves around the break system. In the break system, all of the enemies, including bosses, will have one or more elemental weaknesses. These can be to spells like ice and wind, or to weapons like daggers and bows. If you hit them with their weakness, it'll reduce their shield gauge by 1 point, and when an enemy's shield gauge reaches 0, they get broken. This stuns them for the current turn and the next turn, so if they haven't taken an action yet, you get essentially 2 free actions out of them, and causes them to take more damage from all attacks. This formula is occasionally played with in boss fights by locking away weaknesses until you get rid of minions or something like that, but in general, you want to have a variety of different attacks, both in physical and elemental, in order to hit all enemies and break them. Breaking is very important in Octopath. The other key mechanic is the BP system. This is similar to Braving and Defaulting in Bravely Default, but basically every turn you gain a BP, which is a resource separate from your HP and SP, which are health and mana. BP are battle points, and you can sink them to power up your attacks up to 3 times, for a total of 4 times potency or 4 times extra effect, depending on the attack or ability. Every turn that you don't spend BP, you gain an extra BP, But if you spend BP on the turn, you don't gain an extra at the start of the next turn. So it's sort of a banking your BP until you want to let out an all-out attack. Sometimes you want to spend your BP in order to hit a enemy multiple times with one of their weaknesses to get their weakness gauge down, or sometimes you want to wait and save your BP and spend it on a broken enemy in order to deal significantly more damage. Both the BP and break systems return relatively untouched. However, they interact with a new third pillar of combat, and that is innate skills. Every time your characters take damage or break enemies, they will build some of their innate skill meter. Once full, you can activate these innate skills for a single turn use powerful effect. For example, Throne the Thief gets to move twice when she activates her innate skill meter, whereas Agnia the Dancer can make a single target ability into a AoE ability. Depending on the situation or the enemy, you may want to use different characters' innate skills at different times, and since you can't control how often you take damage, the only way to reliably build the innate skill meter is either to use an item or to make sure that a specific character breaks an enemy. As such, how you use your BP in order to break becomes a calculation of maybe I'll use BP this turn so that my character can break and build their innate skill meter and use their innate skill next turn. It's actually kind of brilliant how the three relatively unrelated systems all interact with each other, because sometimes you'll want to spend BP in order to break an enemy that you wouldn't otherwise so that you get innate skill, but sometimes you want to save BP and break with someone else so that you can have that BP available to power up your innate skill turns. Casti, for example, often wants to use all of her BP on her innate skill turn because her innate skill allows her to craft concoctions without consuming ingredients, and spending the extra BP means she can add more ingredients to the concoction, but it doesn't cost her any extra ingredients because of the innate skill. There's a lot of powerful interactions in how the three systems interact with each other, and that's just one that I've highlighted because Casti was my starting character, so I've had her in combat the entire time. Which brings me to my first negative point. This is something that got carried over from Octopath 1, but was a frustration to me in that game, and is even more frustrating in this game because of how the story is laid out. Whoever you choose to be your first character is designated as the protagonist and can never be removed from the party. This feels like an archaic holdover from other JRPGs that have a more linear-focused story. For example, Chrono is always in your party in Chrono Trigger, and the Luminary is always in your party in Dragon Quest XI. And the reason for this is that those stories are about those individual characters. However, in this one, you are going through 8 relatively unconnected stories. Hikare is trying to reclaim his homeland from his evil brother, whereas Casti is just concerned about figuring out what the cause of her amnesia is. There's no reason that Casti should be a mandatory party member for when I am following Agnia's dream of becoming a superstar. I understand, obviously, that the character whose chapter you're doing should be mandatory, but I don't know why the other 3 slots can't just be whoever you want. I don't know why the first character you start with is locked to your party. It just feels pointless, and it results in them getting over-leveled and making it so that whichever chapter you end up tackling last, you'll often end up having an over-level character for, eliminating some amount of the challenge. That's not to say that Octopath 2 didn't take some steps towards stopping you from getting relatively unbalanced levels of party members. In Octopath 1, whoever you recruited last would usually be far behind the level curve, because everyone joins at level 1, and so they have less time to gain experience running through everyone else's Chapter 1s. In Octopath 2, however, everyone's Chapter 1 is a solo affair, so once you recruit someone, they join as level 1 unit, but they have to go through their own Chapter 1 on their own, gaining a bunch of experience that none of the other party members get. As such, usually by the end of Chapter 1, the character is going to end up around level 5 to 7, and your party ends up feeling much closer to each other in levels. with the exception, of course, of your protagonist, who is stuck in the party at all times other than the flashback chapter ones. On the topic of the flashbacks, they're not the only way in which the structure of Octopath Traveler 2's story has changed. Everyone getting a solo chapter is nice, but if that were it, and we just followed the formula of Octopath 1, I would honestly be kind of upset. Octopath 1's story structure was basically, each chapter you go to town, you use your path skill to solve a non-combat problem, then something else arises, and you have to go through a dungeon. Once you fight your way through a dungeon, you end up facing the boss, fight the boss, defeat the boss, and some sort of resolution happens. Now you gotta move on to a new town. And that was every chapter. And, it's fine for what it is. The stories were small scale and personal, and I actually really enjoy that, but it did feel rather repetitive. Everyone had to go to 4 separate towns, solve 4 separate town problems with their path actions, and then solve 4 separate dungeon problems through combat. Octopath 2 mixes this up. The earliest noticeable change is that some characters have multiple chapter 2s that they can go in the direction of. Throne, for example, wants to kill 2 different people, mother and father, and she has the option to either go mother route chapter 2 or father route chapter 2. If she decides to go mother's route, it is an entirely combat 3 chapter. Instead, you just solve problems in town using her various town actions, and then participate in a medieval-style game of Russian roulette, which was one of the cooler story moments, as far as I've gotten at least. On the other hand, Oswald, in his 3rd chapter, starts off immediate with a boss fight. Then, after that first boss fight, he has to do some town actions, then go through a dungeon, and then fight a second boss. There's also some chapters that are labeled as the Crossing of Paths, which show up if you've gotten multiple characters to a certain point in their story. These are chapters that require you to have both characters in your party and evolve around how the characters' paths cross each other, which I feel like is a direct response to the criticism of Octopath 1 that it felt like the 8 stories were disconnected. I personally was fine with the stories being disconnected, but I do like that they addressed a common criticism and tried to improve it in the story. I am only about halfway through some of the stories and less than that in others, so I can't say definitively if the stories end up being as good as I think they were in Octopath 1, but I do think the fact that they have clearly taken criticism and tried to go in a direction that addresses that bodes well for the overall structure of the story. As with Octopath 1, the voice acting and sprite structure is top-notch, and thankfully we don't have any fake Shakespearean English to deal with in Octopath 2, so yay, that's an very big plus in my book. They've also added an auto-scroll feature similar to what we have in the newer Fire Emblems, because several sections in this are fully voiced, so you can just turn on auto-scroll and sit back and watch it like it's a movie. Unfortunately, the auto-scroll is rather poorly implemented, as it's just a single auto-scroll setting for both voiced and unvoiced cutscenes. So I find myself having to immediately turn it off when I move into a non-voiced cutscene because I'm a slow reader and can't keep up with the text as fast, since the auto-scroll will immediately move on to the next speech bubble once one is filled. This is in particular frustrating because some cutscenes contain a mix of voiced and unvoiced lines, especially with a detective subplot where our cleric, who is basically Sherlock Holmes, goes around and he talks to people, but then he also finds notes and reads them, often in the same cutscene, causing me to miss some of the details in the notes, which are pretty important to a detective story. I applaud them for trying, and I'm glad that the feature is there, but I feel like it's too poorly implemented to be used, and so I personally have it off for that reason. Speaking of poorly implemented features, let's talk about the UX. It has a lot of the same problems that Fire Emblem Engage has, in that what would seem like basic quality of life features are just missing. Equipping skills becomes a frustrating mess because you have to go between 2 different menus in order to learn active skills and then equip the passive skills that you get given as a result. You also don't automatically equip passive skills if you have an empty skill slot, something that feels like a huge oversight. At the very least, they should ask if you want to equip them, rather than having you go into 2 separate submenus to equip and unequip them. Similarly, if you have 4 party members and the other 4 are currently on the bench, and you want to rearrange equipment, you can't rearrange equipment that is equipped by the benched party members onto your unbenched party members unless you go specifically to the tavern, which is where you switch your party members around. Likewise, if you stay at the inn, the bench warmers don't get healed, and if you have a bench warmer who has a ability such as discount at the inn or discount at the store or whatever, that discount is only applied if you take them off the bench. While theoretically, this is to encourage you to only benefit from those passive skills and abilities if you have them in your party, realistically it just means that you have to go to the bar in order to get them out of the bench before you go to the inn and the shops. And the reason for this is all inns and the majority of shops are located in towns, each of which has a tavern to let you change your party members. I would understand if you didn't get the passive discounts from purchasing from merchants either in dungeons or on the road, which do show up occasionally. However, not getting them in town just feels like a time tax. I have to grab my guy out, send 3 party members with him into the inn to get their free rest, and then swap 3 more out to get their free rest. It's just frustrating, and it feels like there's no reason for it. There's also no icons on the minimap for the specific types of stores, which blows my mind, because oftentimes in the big cities, I'll be running around looking for the inn or looking for the tavern, and there's minimap icons for almost everything else in the game. Minimap icons for side quests, for hidden items, for main quests, for where a town is if you're out in the overworld, for where a dungeon is if you're in the overworld or in the town, and for where the jobs guilds are, which is a newly added feature that only exists in towns, but for some reason they do not have minimap icons for the basic town facilities of item, weapon, inn, and bartender shops. But I mentioned the guilds, and that is a newly added feature, and that's how reclassing works in this game. In my opinion, it is a strict upgrade to reclassing in Octopath 1. As I mentioned earlier, Octopath 1, you would find shrines in the overworld, and they grant you access to secondary jobs. You can assign those secondary jobs to someone else. So for example, if you get the secondary job for cleric, you can give secondary job to cleric to your mage, and then your mage will have both mage and cleric skills. He does not get access to the cleric passives, but he does get access to all of the cleric spells and can use any weapons that the cleric could use, even if the mage couldn't normally use them. Octopath 1 still has those shrines, but instead of granting you the secondary classes, it gives your initial character a powerful ability. For example, when I found the Apothecary Shrine, it gave my Apothecary a skill that was an axe attack that dealt extra damage if the enemy has debuffs on them, but it cures their debuffs and scales the extra damage based on how many it cured. So, without being able to be in shrines, the secondary jobs had to find a new place, and that's where the guild comes in. Each job has a guild that belongs to them, so the guild of the priest, the guild of the hunter, etc. When you first enter the guild, you can get a single membership, which functions much like the secondary jobs in Octopath 1. You are able to assign it to one person at a time can gain that secondary job. This allows them to use the spell list, use the weapons, etc. However, there are also quests that the guild will give you, and each quest of the guild that you complete gives you a second license. So, if you've completed one quest for the Warriors Guild, then you can assign the warrior subject to 2 separate people, one for the initial membership and one for the quest. Additionally, the guilds will give you hints in terms of where to find things related to that job. So the Thief Guild will tell you where the Shrine of the Thief is, and also where a legendary weapon that falls into one of the thieves' categories of swords and daggers is located. I really like this system, because it means if there's a specific job that you think is especially helpful for a certain boss coming up or a dungeon, or you just really like, you can have everyone in your party get that as a sub-job as long as you've invested enough into the guild side quests. The side quests aren't terribly complicated. They're, for example, get a bunch of this ingredient and bring it back here, or something like that. But they are enough of a hurdle that you don't get them for free, but you do get rewarded if you want to go out of the way and get extra of a certain job. It's a really cool evolution. A+ in my book. The last really big change I want to comment on is the day and night system. I've seen it referred to as a day and night cycle by gaming publications, but that's just not what it is. You can press a button to cycle between daytime and nighttime, and this affects a couple of things. It moves around some of the NPCs or gets rid of some of the NPCs who either aren't out at night or aren't out during the day, which can have implications for side quests, as sometimes you might need to find an NPC who's only around at a specific time. An early side quest I ran into had someone complain that a thief had stolen their goods, and then you go up to the thief's hideout and change it to nighttime, the thief shows up, and you can steal them back. This, however, also opens up more possibilities with the path actions, because each character has a different path action during the day and the night. The classic 4 path actions from Octopath 1 are back, that be get a follower, get an item, knock someone down, or find information. However, now there are even more approaches to it than there were in Octopath. In the first game, it was basically just use the good way or use the bad way. In this one, however, if you want to have an item that an NPC holds, you can attempt to purchase it with your merchant, attempt to steal it with your thief, ask for it as a gift with your dancer, or attempt to 1v1 combat them with your scholar and steal it in a muggin. These multiple approaches do sometimes run each other redundant. For example, if your thief only has an 80% chance of stealing an item, but you're a high enough level to get it with your dancer, there's really no reason to try stealing it with your thief. But it does mean that you can generally approach every problem at least somewhat effectively with any party compilation. It also hilariously can lead to you having a chain of 8 people following behind you, plus an animal companion, if you have the right stream of party members, since now you can have 4 separate party members, each get companions. And I just find that hilarious. I love the idea of just the big long conga line of 2D sprites plus an owl all flying around and just running through this world together. But yeah, I'm sure there's something or other that I'm forgetting to touch on. There is a lot that got added to this game. But I think I've covered everything that feels huge, and also my frustrations with the things that didn't get added. Most of the flaws that I mentioned were flaws that were inherent with Octopath 1, and they bothered me in that game too, but the fact that they weren't addressed and weren't fixed bothers me a little bit more, if that makes sense. I still recommend that you pick it up if you have any interest in standard JRPGs. It's not my favorite, but it's among my favorite, and I think that the things that Octopath 2 adds are all evolutions in the right direction. The combat is more complex, and the difficulty is, as a result, higher, meaning that you can no longer just go through even standard enemy encounters by just spamming lance attacks, spamming axe attacks, etc. I think it's fun. If you liked Octopath 1, you'll probably like Octopath 2 even better, and if you were on the fence, yeah, go for it. Octopath 2 is pretty darn good, but it is just shy of a masterpiece, and that's a shame.